So, Miles, we're now less than a week away from the election in Taiwan. Every election in a democracy is consequential, but looking down the barrel of PRC aggression, it's all the more so. So, what are your thoughts and what are you watching for now that we're so close?
Well, every election in Taiwan is consequential in light of the existence of the tensions between Taiwan and mainland China, the communist China. We don't know exactly how it's going to turn out because the three-way race is very, very close. But we can discuss some of the very important new developments coming out of this election cycle, which is different from 4 years ago or 8 years ago. One of the very important development coming out of this intense campaigning and presidential debates is the redefinition of the agency of the PRC-ROC tensions. That is, who is actually responsible for the tensions between Communist China and Taiwan? Well, running for presidency, our three candidates represent the KMT, which is the largest opposition, DPP, which is the incumbent, and of course there's a TPP, the Taiwan People's Party, represented by the former mayor of Taipei, Mr. Ko. Now, the KMT on this particular issue, who is responsible for the tensions, for Taiwan's security crisis? KMT blames the DPP, the incumbent, for causing the tensions, saying they're just too democratic, too emphatic about Taiwan's independence. The DPP, on the other hand, countered that the CCP is the ultimate culprit for the tensions, not the DPP. And the running candidate for presidency of DPP, Mr. Lai Ching-te, William Lai, who is the incumbent vice president, said in one of the three debates very famously that, in fact, in the eyes of the CCP, of the Chinese Communist Party, the fact that all three candidates are taking part in this truly democratic, free, and open election is pro-independence. The voters will have to decide on that. This is a very, very important articulation of this key debate. The second very important development is that both KMT, DPP, and the third party candidate, TPP, all agree that the future of Taiwan will be determined by the Taiwanese voters. And this is very important because very keen on people's mind in Taiwan is the possibility that one of the three parties may engage in intense negotiation with the Chinese Communist Party about the future of Taiwan. And now all three parties agree that the future of Taiwan cannot be negotiated away in the back room with Beijing, but they will be determined by the Taiwanese voters. The third thing, which I think is probably the most important, is convergence of views on what exactly is the status quo. The most significant reality in Taiwan and in Taiwan's political landscape is that overwhelming majority of people in Taiwan, somewhere close to 90%, are for status quo. In other words, in the past, there were only two options. So the KMT is widely labeled as pro-unification with China. The DPP has been known and has been charged by China mostly as the pro-independence. So it's unification and independence. This fight has been going on for decades. But now, this year, this sort of a dichotomy between unification and independence has become less and less meaningful because there is a critical third factor, that is status quo. So all three parties agree status quo is very important, and they're all endeavoring to maintain that. Now the question is, what is status quo? So you have several options, right? One definition is that, well, status quo means that no unification with the PRC. Another one is, no new declaration of independence. So, but the third option is that, well, status quo is in fact independence. On this particular issue that the DPP has a very clear answer. The KMT cannot really elaborate on this. That is, the status quo is independence. So I think the KMT is struggling with that point. And one final aspect of this, anybody who has been observing the Taiwanese election and will be in awe of the institutional upgrade and advanced nature of Taiwanese voting process. There are basically very different from the United States, which demonstrate to the point that Taiwan is a mature and a very fair and open election. They have basically 4 particular measures that we don't have. One is that in order to maximize voter participation, all Taiwanese elections, particularly presidential elections, will take place on Saturdays, not Tuesdays, as in the United States. So that will basically means that Saturday is the off day. Most people don't work, so people participate more fully and therefore more democratic. Another part is that in order to guarantee fairness, and there is a particular clause in the Taiwanese presidential election law that says that no polling results will be allowed to publish 10 days before the voting day. This is to prevent sort of spinning and opinion influence. And the third aspect is in order to prevent fraud, the election law in Taiwan says that there shall be no mail-in voting. All voting will take place in person, and the results will be announced immediately after the election. This is very important. And finally, I will say the Taiwanese election is very, very fascinating because it is supervised by a respected Central Election Commission. That Central Election Commission is very tiny, it is small, but then the result will be certified by that small and tiny Central Election Commission and has basically been no controversy. That basically means that Taiwanese voters' confidence in the fairness and judiciousness of the Taiwanese election processes.
I wanted to ask you a recent Reuters article by Michael Martina and David Brunstrom. It began by saying Taiwan's election next week poses challenges for Washington no matter who wins. Their argument being that the DPP win could exacerbate tension with China, while a KMT win, might raise awkward questions about the island's defense policies. Do you agree with this characterization, or do you think that there's a clear sort of preference from Washington's perspective?
No, again, that's basically is an argument without nuance and without really sort of pay attention to some of the new developments that I just mentioned. For example, if the article supposes that if DPP incumbency wins, therefore will cause further attention, that falls into the trap of who is actually to blame for the attention. They blame the DPP. They blame victims, right? So the real culprit causing attention actually is the Chinese Communist Party. That's why it's not going to be. Unfortunately, some pretty much like deluded think tank policy makers in Washington, D.C. are making the same argument. It's kind of silly, as exemplified in the recent publication of the article in the magazine Foreign Affairs. So that has been widely rebutted and debunked. So I don't think that's what's going to be happen. The KMT obviously is the biggest opposition. But again, KMT agree with DPP on many things. There's more agreement, even though they don't openly sort of admit it, this agreement between KMT and DPP. Because, for example, the KMT actually agree very clearly that they do not endorse the one country, two systems formula. And KMT also agree the future of Taiwan will be determined by the Taiwanese voters. So there's no security dilemma here of any significance portion here. So I really don't buy that argument that is so obsolete and without really sort of a foresight.
No, that certainly makes sense. And I guess just as a last question, from a U.S. perspective, the Taiwanese election is almost entirely about China. And, there might be a tendency to forget about their domestic concerns, everyday, kitchen table issues. Is this the case from the Taiwanese perspective? Is it to what degree does the China question drive voters? Or, I mean, is it the case that they're kind of just numb to the pressure they face from China and are more focused on sort of everyday issues than we might think?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I mean, I think it's a fair question. In the early stage of this presidential campaign, all of the candidates tend to focus more on the bread and butter issues, in other words, domestic economic performance and the future of Taiwanese technology, those kind of issues. But gradually, particularly the oppositions against the incumbency, they're running out of issues because that become a little bit, less important to them because Taiwanese economy is doing very well. I mean, Taiwanese overall, there are some mistakes, but I think Taiwanese economy has been sort of a very robust. For example, Taiwanese GDP per capita is the highest in East Asia, surpassing Japan and South Korea, which is remarkable. But then in the middle course of the campaign and the later part of the campaign, the issue was shifted to security and not basically mainland China. I think opposition KMT uses China's military threat, this pledge to use force to take over Taiwan as a sort of, a campaign issue to scare the voters, and they label DPP too cantankerous, too aggressive. And DPP say, hey, listen, whatever we do, whatever we say, if CCP doesn't like you, they're going to threaten you with force. So that's basically, in the second part. And currently, I think the issue of dealing with the mainland China has become dominant.
Now, that makes perfect sense. So for our next topic, the prominent Chinese shadow bank, Zhongji, filed for bankruptcy this past weekend. This followed an investigation into the firm launched in November of 2023 for suspected illegal crimes. Miles, can you give us some background here? What role does this firm play in the Chinese financial sector, and how significant is this development?
This is very significant. Zhongzi is the largest non-state lending firm. And China's basic development model depends on a massive infusion of capital in infrastructure construction, housing, for example, those things. And by normal standard, those loans would never have been given out because there is no collateral, there's no sort of financial due diligence. So the Chinese state banks mostly just give out money to all these development projects. But then that is not even enough. So there is a lot of so-called private or non-state lending wealth management firms. Zhongzi is the largest. Now I have to qualify immediately though that because China is a communist country, there is really no private financial institution or private economy per se. And the so-called non-state sectors in Chinese economy, they're all share very intricate connection with Chinese Communist Party bureaucracy. For example, Zhongzi was created by this guy from China's northeast, and he became very prominent because he has a brother who was the general secretary and the general manager of the Chinese Communist Party's gigantic 100% state-owned sovereign fund, Central Foreign Exchange Investment Company, also known as Huijin in Chinese. So, and he had this connection. So the Zhongzi's founder and a longtime president and CEO was a gentleman by the name of Xie Zhikun. And he suddenly died 2 years ago at the age of 60, which is very mysterious. Ever since, this financial giant is in trouble because Xi Jinping realized that he would like to take charge of China's economic and particularly financial decision-making. And that's why he went after this non-state sectors companies such as Zhongzi. And he wanted the Zhongzi to basically give up his money and to support China's finance, but basically try to rob this particularly important bank to support China's finances, which is in trouble due to the collapse of the China's real estate empire. But Zhongzi said, listen, I really would like to help you, but I myself was in trouble because the entire lending and loaning industry in China is like a Ponzi scheme. So I'm actually, in fact, is going to default. So that's a problem. And now finally, this financial giant is declaring bankruptcy last week. And this is going to be a very, very big deal in China. And similar financial empires in China with very strong bureaucratic political connections are also in trouble. For example, the CEO of the behemoth Anbang Insurance, Wu Xiaohui, is now serving 18 years in jail term in China. Wu Xiaohui was the grandson-in-law of former Chinese dictator Deng Xiaoping. I mean, he's now in trouble. Xiao Jianhua, who is the CEO of the Mingtian Financial Empire, the Tomorrow Financial Group, also has deep tie with the Chinese Parliament Bureau Economy Standing Committee member. And he is now in jail serving a 13-year term. And this guy, Xiao Jianhua, is even more bizarre. He was kidnapped in the Peninsula Hotel in Hong Kong by Chinese agent. And he went back to China for trial because he refused to cooperate with China by giving up basically his private wealth management firm. And this is all very, very Chinese style. The Chinese Communist Party can let you rise, but can also squeeze you to death if you cannot help a time of crisis. And this is Zhongzhi's bankruptcy is a perfect example.
This just seems like a recurring trend with China's financial ills, that it is the party sticking its hand in economic activity, trying to get a piece or trying to sort of guide companies. To what degree is the Chinese Communist Party creating economic problems for itself, or is there merit to some of these investigations and they do need to kind of rein in a corrupt economic sector?
Many people seem to suggest that the reason why Xi Jinping is going after all these non-state financial firms is because China does not have money. It's not that simple. Yes, China does not have enough money, but also simultaneously, China has a lot of money. China is the world's richest government. It has a foreign currency reserve of over $3 trillion, the largest of any government in the world. So Chinese Communist Party is extraordinarily rich. The problem is a lot of people in China are not rich. Even though government is very rich, wealthy, they can build all kinds of skyscrapers in China sponsored by the government. But the people's income is pretty low, right? We talk about this on this program many times. The income per capita in China is among the lowest in the world. 40% of the people in China, in other words, about over 600 million people in China, are making less than $5 a day. 96% of the people in China, in other words, 1.3 billion people in China, make under $23 a day. This is according to China International Capital Corporation Limited, Zhongjin's statistical analysis. But then people might ask, how did China spend money? The Communist Party has a lot of money. Where did the money go? Obviously not spending on people. In fact, China's money are spending on the following major projects. Number one, China has to spend a lot of money to maintain the world's largest police state, surveillance system, and enormous amount of security forces to guard against the dissidents, guard against foreign spies, for example. So China's domestic political stability budget is larger than its defense budget, which is the second largest in the world. Just think about that. Another way of China spend money is global influence peddling projects, particularly Belt and Road Initiative projects. Most of them were not really based upon market mechanism, mostly based upon geopolitical purposes. So that's why the BRI project are not doing really well right now, but it's very costly for China. Thirdly, of course, China spends a lot of money on its military. China's military right now is doing very well, and so that's very costly. Lastly, and this is not to be ignored, now China's money, government money, is basically eroded, taken away by enormous corruption. entire Chinese society from top to the bottom. Officials, over 100 million strong Chinese Communist Party members, they control the major sinews of the society. Those officials spend enormous amount of money on banquets, right? They're expensive pleasure events. And to be honest with you, and there's an enormous amount of embezzlement by officials. About half of the local government budgets in all of China goes to official extravaganza, mostly lavish banquets. And then, of course, recently, in last week, there's a report about the corruption within the Chinese People's Liberation Army. That is particularly the China's strategic force, the PLA rocket force, is cutting corners in its long-range missile development, putting a lot of water in there in lieu of liquid fuel in its rockets. And this is basically nothing new if you live in the Chinese political environment, because this is happening all the time. But then it's shocking to the outside world. So the corruption is really stupefying in China. That's where Chinese money is spent on. But instead of spending on governance, on its people, the Chinese Communist Party has its own agenda.
For our last question, I thought we'd go a bit broader. Now that we're at the beginning of 2024, Miles, it seems like it's a good time to ask you, what are your thoughts and predictions heading into the new year? Do you have any sort of general trends you anticipate or things with respect to China?
Well, many of the things that have been going on in China's global outreach are going on, but in a sort of you can see there's some new patterns emerging. Let's just talk about BRICS, for example. The BRICS is initially started as a trade group, but now it's becoming more political and geopolitical. Right? China wants to be leader of that. BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. But now it's expanding. But now, that expansion has faced some headwinds starting with the new year, right? Very important part of the BRICS project is Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has been heavily invested by the Chinese for its strategic political location, particularly the maritime ports. But Sri Lanka is now under enormous pressure by one of the BRICS members, that is India. So India put a lot of pressure on Sri Lanka. So Sri Lanka now just issued a ban on all Chinese ships to dock in Sri Lanka ports for a year. This is enormous development. China is taken by surprise. Not only that, in its recent BRICS conference in South Africa, it's been announced that scores of countries want to join. But one of the most important countries, Argentina, has a new election and it has a different leadership team. So Argentina has openly announced that it has changed its mind. So Buenos Aires is going to basically decline the invitation to join BRICS. So it's a problem. But then, of course, starting with the new year of 2024, you see this rapid halt of international investments going to China, causing panics. Most of the firms, major firms in the world, are exiting China. So decoupling is happening. You might also see the continuation of the Biden administration's trade policy on China that has been sort of started. That was started in the Trump administration. The U.S. has decided to continue its trade tariffs on Chinese imports, and this is going to stay. All sanctions on Chinese companies and entities that has human rights violations or violation of U.S. law, sanction regimes remain unchanged. So there's even more sanctions added on a monthly basis. On war in Ukraine and Gaza, obviously, this is major developments in the world. But China's role of fake neutrality is being increasingly exposed as fake because we have discovered that China, even though there's no direct assistance of lethal weapons to either Russia or Hamas, but they have been playing a very important role. China has been playing a very important role in buttressing the economic system of Russia, for example. China has shipped enormous amount of dual-use equipment, trucks, cars, automobile cars, and aircraft, and drones, for example, to Russia to support Russia's war machine, and also, of course, buying Russia oil in violation of international sanction regimes. Now, we just saw the report last week. The Israelis have discovered huge cache of Chinese-made weapons. We don't know whether those were directly shipped by China or China sent these weapons to Hamas by a third party. But the fact that the Chinese are supporting Hamas directly or indirectly, so that's becoming a very, very new phenomenon. The most obvious one, of course, is the intensification of China's aggression in the South China Sea and Taiwan Strait, Persian Gulf, and the Red Sea. So Chinese naval forces have been causing trouble. You can read that in international in news reporting. So all in all, I think emerging out of all this new development in 2024, we can see two major narratives. This will emerge as dominant, I predict, for 2024. That is, number one, China has always tried to portray the United States as its only enemy. And that narrative is not going to work because it's increasingly clear that in 2024, the issue of the world is not China versus the United States. It's going to be China versus the rest of the world. Number two, I think the new trend in 2024 is that China will be further isolated internationally. So I'll just stop right there.
万事不求人，私人助理、私人顾问时代来临了。六度万事，万事相助，超强博士群不断奉献专项服务，信息、财经、健康、文娱、教育、旅游、消费、科技、美食，让您的生活品质全线升级。六度世界现在体验，请去3w.6度.world。
限时免费期间，全体注册网友免费使用付费版的高级功能如下：支持论坛搜索，免费画图。第一步，点击右上角最左边的机器人符号开始对话，像图片中红框中的那样。第二步，如图选择六度万事，我们未来将推出更多的 AI 供大家选择。然后就可以与六博士悄悄畅谈了。还支持论坛内部信息搜索哦。您还可以让六博士做你的助手，帮你绘制漂亮图片。最后可以点击添加好友进来，一起与六博士工作。一起来3w.6度.world尝试吧。